Topic 1D, bias in studies. So, what is a biased study or an unbiased study? What is bias? Bias is something that affects the outcome. So, an unbiased study is a study that's conducted in a way that it produces the correct result on average. So basically, an unbiased study accurately represents the truth, as opposed to a biased study, which is conducted in a way that it tends to overestimate or underestimate the true value. So, an unbiased study accurately represents the truth. A biased study does not represent the truth. It either tends to overestimate or underestimate the true value. So what we want to look at here are what are some sources of bias. Where does this bias in our studies come from? So the first one we're going to talk about is voluntary response bias. Voluntary response bias. Well, we already talked about voluntary response when we were talking about sampling. We said that those who voluntarily respond tend to have strong opinions. It tends to be the people that are very much for or very much against. So it's unlikely that it's going to accurately represent the population as a whole. And so this creates a voluntary response bias. It affects the outcome and makes it so that it is unlikely that that study will accurately represent the truth. Another type is self-interest bias. Self-interest bias. We have some interest vested in the result. So a self-interest bias, if we have an interest in the outcome, then it is likely that we will do things that will affect the outcome to be more in our favor. This is why you'll sometimes hear of a disinterested third party. You bring in someone who their job is just to do the experiment or to do the study. They don't care what the result is. They get paid the same no matter what the result is. Their job is just to do the experiment or do the study. So we're avoiding the self-interest bias of that one, because if you have an interest in it, then you're going to have a tendency to look for things that prove your point. Don't confuse me with the facts. My mind's already made up. That's self-interest bias. I look at what I want to see, and that's what I see. So self-interest bias. Another type of bias is social acceptability bias. Social acceptability bias. That's where people are afraid to give a socially unacceptable response. So they have a tendency to answer questions in the way that is socially acceptable as opposed to what they truly believe or what truly happens. A good example of something like this is I tend to ask in my classes when I'm in person, I'll ask the question, who here has taken an illegal drug in the last week? And I will get nobody raising their hand, or maybe one person, and that one person is that wild card, that one student that you never know what they're going to say. But social acceptability. They know in a classroom setting where I, as an authority figure, am asking this question, that it's not socially acceptable to say, yeah, I did marijuana last night. Or I did such and such, or I took this. So they will answer in what's considered to be a socially acceptable way. Same thing when you do a study about domestic violence. Spouse abuse, parental abuse, child abuse. No matter how anonymous people believe that the study is, they are unlikely to admit things that they feel are not considered to be correct or allowable in society. So that's social acceptability bias. And then there's leading question bias. That's where questions are worded in such a way that it tends to steer the respondent to a certain response. If you've ever read a political survey, you know exactly what I'm talking about here with a leading question bias. You can look at a political survey and you know which party sent it out, whether it was Republican or Democrat, just by reading the questions, because they're leading you to answer in a certain way. The wording makes you want to answer in a certain way because it seems wrong to answer the other way, even though you may feel different. Or it just tricks you into answering in a certain way. I've seen numerous articles during elections where you look at the article that you're voting on and you read their summary of it, and you have no idea what you're voting on. In fact, the summary is worded in such a way that it makes you think you're voting for the exact opposite of what you really are. So that's leading question bias. The wording changes the way people respond. Non-response bias. With non-response bias, people who don't respond, their opinions tend to be different from those who do. So by not responding to a question, you can actually be changing the result. Think of it as the silent majority. Right? If you think about a lot of these things that happen, you get these small groups that go and protest and talk to their legislators and get certain laws put in place or overruled. And they're in the minority, but they went and they fought for it. Whereas the majority who didn't do anything, didn't fight against it, they go, whoa, how did this ever happen? Nobody really wants that to happen. Well, the minority did, and they're the ones that spoke. The majority did not. They did not respond. They're the non-responders, and therefore we created a non-response bias by not getting involved. Non-response bias fits in very closely with the voluntary response, right? The people who voluntarily respond tend to be extremes. The non-responders tend to be the less extreme. So those two fit together very well. And the last type of bias is sampling bias. Right? Sampling bias. And yes, I started writing bias on these lower ones. You could probably write them on all the other ones. But sampling bias is just when the method that was used to select the sample created a bias or an underestimate or overestimate of the true value. So sampling bias, we may go, and convenience sample is a good example of a sampling bias. We went and we chose a sample that way, and it's not representative of the actual population, right? Or we go, and another example is we could be doing a systematic sample where we go and we look at a telephone book and we start calling people up for surveys. Well, what are we doing? Well, if I'm a surveyor and I'm doing this 9 to 5 Monday through Friday systematic sample, well, what am I doing? I'm looking at a phone book to call people up. It's Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Well, I've just eliminated anybody who does not have a landline because cell phones are not listed in phone directories, in phone books. And I've eliminated people who work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, or people who just go to school during the day, or people who are out doing other things during the day. So who am I left with? I'm left with those people who have landlines, who are home all day. And that's going to change the result and therefore overestimate or underestimate the true value. So that's topic 1D, bias in studies.